There's a particular kind of cruelty that wears the face of practicality. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It comes quietly, in the form of a signed document, a handshake between men who have already decided, and a rusted machine left sitting in a field like a monument to someone else's contempt. I've ridden through a lot of country in my years. I've seen land that broke men before they ever got a crop in the ground. I've watched families pack wagons and leave without looking back, and I've watched others dig their fingers into dry earth and refuse, absolutely refuse, to let go. But I have never, not once in 43 years of moving through the territories and the rangelands and the wide, quiet places between towns, seen anything like what Mara Tennyson did with 60 acres of exhausted soil, one broken-down John Deere tractor, and the particular kind of fury that only comes when someone who loves you decides your failure would be satisfying to watch. I almost rode past her place. I almost didn't stop. That would have been the greatest mistake of my life, not because of what I witnessed, but because of what it taught me about the specific gravity of a woman who has decided she is not finished. This is what I wrote down afterward in the worn leather log I keep behind my saddle. I write things down because I'm afraid of forgetting. I'm afraid that the world moves too fast and that the important things, the real things, slip away before anyone thinks to hold them. I'm holding this one. Not the woman, not the land. The tractor sitting at the edge of a field that had been recently turned, maybe 2 or 3 days prior based on the way the soil had already begun to crust in the August heat. It was a 1967 John Deere 3020, or what remained of one. The hood was buckled on the left side like something had tried to fold it. The rear left tire was flat and cracked so badly the rubber had begun to separate from the rim in long peeling strips. One of the hydraulic lines had been cut. Deliberately, I'd learn later, though at the time I assumed where, and the line had bled dry into the dirt beneath the chassis, leaving a dark stain the shape of a reaching hand. I pulled my horse up at the fence line because I have a habit of cataloging broken things. It's a quirk my wife always found both endearing and exhausting. You stop for every wounded bird, she used to say. One day a wounded bird is going to bite you. She wasn't wrong, but I stopped anyway and I took out my log and I wrote August 14th. Broken 3020 at field edge. Rear hydraulic severed. Someone's bad season or someone's bad intention. I hadn't decided which yet. The woman came around from behind the machine, about 30 seconds after I'd written that. She didn't notice me immediately. She was focused on something beneath the engine housing, a wrench in her left hand, her right hand braced against the chassis, and she was speaking, though I couldn't hear the words from the fence line. Not speaking to anyone present. Speaking to the machine or to herself in the low and focused way of someone who has had a long argument with the universe and is still mid-sentence. She was maybe 35, possibly 40, that particular age where weather and work start to tell a story in a person's face that's separate from whatever story they'd planned to tell. Her hair was dark, pulled back with what looked like a piece of baling twine. Her jeans were stiff with dried mud at the knees, and she was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow despite the heat, which told me either she was unbothered by the August sun or she had something on her forearms she wasn't interested in showing. She finally looked up. We stared at each other across the fence for a moment, the way strangers do in open country, making the rapid calculation of threat or curiosity. I tipped my hat. She looked back down at the engine. I took that as an invitation of sorts, or at least not a prohibition, and I rode along the fence line to the gate, dismounted, and walked my horse through. She still didn't look up. The wrench was moving now, not with the careful, measured turns of someone following a manual, but with the specific urgency of someone who has been fighting this particular bolt for a long time and has recently decided to win. "You need a hand," I said. "I've got two," she said. The bolt came free. She held it up briefly. Not to show me, I don't think, just in the automatic gesture of checking that the thing you retrieved is actually the thing you wanted. Then set it carefully on top of the engine housing and reached back into the cavity for the component beneath. I stood there. I have a tendency to linger in situations where I've been neither welcomed nor expelled. My mother called it stubbornness. I prefer the word patience, though I'll admit the line between them is thinner than most people acknowledge. "That hydraulic line was cut," I said. A pause, not a long one. "I know." "Recent." 3 weeks ago Tuesday. She said it with the flatness of someone who has already processed the anger of that fact and come out the other side into something colder and more purposeful. I recognized that tone. I'd heard it in men who'd lost cattle to drought and decided, quietly, that they were going to find a way to run water where water had never run. I'd heard it in women who'd been told their land wasn't worth saving and had proceeded to save it without asking anyone's permission. I wrote in my log, she already knows what was done to her. She's past the grief of it. Her name was Mara. I learned that gradually, the way you learn things about people in the West, not through direct question and answer, which is considered somewhat impolite in the old tradition, but through accumulation. A piece here, a piece there, assembled over the course of an afternoon into something that resembles understanding. What I assembled was this. The land had been hers and her husband's. 62 acres of mixed-use farmland, some row crops, some pasture, an orchard section at the north end that had been planted by her grandmother in 1931 and still produced apples in the fall, though the yields had been declining for a decade. The marriage had lasted 11 years. The dissolution of it had been completed 6 weeks prior, in a county courthouse 40 miles east, in a proceeding that had lasted less than 2 hours. Her husband, I'll call him Dale because that's the name she used once and then did not use again, had negotiated the settlement himself, had presented it to her as a fair division, which is a phrase that always means the person presenting it has already decided what fair means in a way that benefits them considerably. She'd received the 62 acres, minus the eastern pasture, which Dale had retained, along with the farmhouse, which needed a roof, and the equipment, which consisted of the broken 30-20 I was currently standing next to, and a seed drill with a cracked frame that was sitting behind the barn in approximately the same condition as my faith in marital institutions. Dale had kept the working truck, the functioning tractor, a newer Kubota they'd purchased together in 2019, the cattle and the grain contracts. He'd also, in the week before the paperwork was finalized, drained the hydraulic system on the 30-20 and cut the line. Small cruelty, carefully timed. Designed to be discovered after the documents were signed, when there was nothing to be done about it legally without more money and more time than a newly single woman managing a failing farm could reasonably spend. It was the kind of cruelty that required a specific imagination, not the hot kind, not the breaking dishes kind, but the cold and patient kind that plans ahead, that thinks, what can I damage that will look like neglect rather than sabotage? I asked her, around the time the sun was dropping toward the western tree line, and she'd moved from the hydraulic system to something in the front axle assembly, whether she'd considered selling. She looked at me then, direct and flat, the way people look when they want to be sure you understand what they're about to say. This was my grandmother's orchard, she said. That was the entire answer. I wrote it down verbatim. I helped her where I could that afternoon, not because I'm a mechanic, which I am not, but because I can hand tools and hold components, and occasionally provide the second set of hands that makes the difference between a job that takes an hour and a job that takes 3. She was precise and methodical in a way that suggested she had done considerable research before touching the machine. Later, I'd see the notebook, a spiral-bound thing with a cracked cover that she kept on the engine housing. It was full of diagrams, hand-drawn, carefully labeled, cross-referenced with page numbers that turned out to correspond to a repair manual she'd downloaded and printed at the county library 2 weeks earlier. She'd never worked on a tractor engine before. I know this because she told me, not with embarrassment, but as a simple statement of the timeline. Before the divorce, I didn't know how to do this. Now I do. The acquisition of the skill was presented not as an achievement, but as a necessary response to circumstances, the way you describe learning to swim if someone had thrown you into deep water. What struck me, though, what I wrote down while she wasn't looking, was the notebook, the diagrams, the library-printed manual. This had started before she touched the machine, before she ever turned a wrench. She'd spent weeks learning first, planning first, understanding the system before she tried to fix it. That wasn't desperation, that was discipline. There's a difference, and most people never understand it until they need it. By the time the light had gone enough that she couldn't see clearly into the engine housing, she put her tools down and wiped her hands on a rag that had long since stopped being useful for wiping anything. She looked at the machine for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not satisfaction, not frustration, somewhere in between. the face of someone taking stock of what's been done and what remains. "You heading somewhere?" she said. "Generally," I said. "There's a spare room," she said, "if you want to stop generally for the night." I said yes. Not because I needed the room. I've slept under the open sky for enough of my life that a spare room is a luxury rather than a necessity, but because I understood that the offer wasn't quite about hospitality. It was about having a witness, not for sympathy, not for company, for the specific comfort of having someone present who could see that she was still here, still moving, still working. I understand that need. I felt it myself. Over dinner, which was simple and good, soup made from what was in the garden and bread she'd baked that morning, she talked, and I mostly listened, because I've found that the best thing I can do in most situations is be quiet and pay attention. She talked about the farm, about the soil, how the east section had been depleted by Dale's rotation choices over the last 4 years, how she'd already pulled samples and sent them to the extension office for testing. She talked about the orchard, how she'd been reading about heritage variety restoration, how the old trees might respond better with different pruning approaches. She talked about the seed drill and whether the cracked frame could be welded or whether she'd need to find a replacement. She did not talk about Dale. Once, passing the window that faced the eastern pasture, the part that wasn't hers anymore, she paused for a moment. Just a fraction of a second. Her hand rested on the window frame and she looked out at the dark field. Then she turned back and told me about a woman in the county 2 towns over who'd started a cooperative grain arrangement with 4 other small farms, and whether something like that might be worth exploring. I stayed 3 days. I told myself I was staying because the north pasture fence needed a second person to stretch wire properly, and she'd mentioned it in passing, and I had the time and it seemed useful. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I hadn't seen anything worth writing down, really worth writing down, the kind of thing that stays in a log and eventually becomes a story you tell people, in a long time. And I was watching something happen on those 62 acres that I didn't have a name for yet, but recognized the way you recognize weather, by the way it changes the air before it arrives. The second morning, a woman came up the drive in a dust-coated pickup. Her name was Patris, and she was Mara's neighbor from the property to the north, 800 acres of wheat and canola, that she ran with her brother and her son, who was 17, and had the particular combination of height and helplessness that 17-year-old boys often carry around like an unwanted inheritance. Patris was perhaps 60, with the kind of permanently tanned forearms that mean decades of real outdoor work, and she brought a casserole dish and a piece of information. The casserole was a gesture of continuity, the kind of thing neighbors bring when they've decided you're still worth feeding, which is actually a statement of faith in your persistence. The information was about the tractor. "My brother's got a 30-20 he's been parting out," Patris said, standing in the kitchen while Mara served coffee. "Hydraulic pump's still good, might be other things you need too." Mara's face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did, a small recalibration like a compass needle finding north. "What does he want for it?" Mara said. "He hasn't decided yet," Patris said, "but I told him it was for you, so he'll be fair." There was something in how she said for you, a weight in it, a meaning that I gathered had to do with history I wasn't part of. I didn't ask. I wrote in my log, "Neighbor knew before she arrived that fair treatment was required." That's not charity. That's a community deciding who it's in favor of. That distinction matters enormously in rural places, where the mechanisms of support are rarely explicit but almost never accidental. After Patris left, Mara took her coffee out to the field and I followed, because that's what I do. She stood at the edge of the section she'd been planning to put into winter wheat, a 30-acre block that ran along the southern property line. The soil test results had come back the day before. The news had not been good. 4 years of aggressive monoculture without adequate cover cropping or nutrient replacement had left the ground depleted in ways that would take time to correct, time and amendment costs that were not small. She'd been quiet since reading the report, not defeated quiet, calculating quiet. "How long?" I said. "To get it fully right, 2-3 years." She looked at the field. "To get something out of it this cycle, 6 weeks if I start amending now." "That's a short window." "I know." She drank her coffee. I've been looking at legumes, field peas, maybe hairy vetch as a cover, fix some nitrogen, give the soil something to work with. Won't be wheat this year. That cuts your income. What income? She said, not bitterly, just accurately. Then, I've been talking to a buyer. Farm-to-table outfit out of the city, 2 hours east. They want specialty crops, things that aren't commodity priced. She paused. They want a supplier who can do consistent quality across multiple products, not just wheat, not just corn. That's a pivot, I said. That's a plan, she said. There's a particular look people get when they've been thinking something for a while, turning it over in private, testing it against reality, and have finally decided to say it out loud. Not because they need approval, but because saying it out loud makes it real in a different way. Commits it to the air, makes it harder to take back. She had that look. I wrote in my log, she's not rebuilding what was here before. She's building something that wasn't here before. That's different, and I think she's known that for a while. The third day, I helped her with the fence, as promised. We worked along the north edge of the property through the morning, driving posts and stretching wire, the work rhythmic and mostly silent in the way that physical labor with a compatible person tends to go. She was strong, not performatively, not in the way people get when they're trying to prove something, but in the functional way of someone whose body has always been a tool she trusted and maintained. Around mid-morning, she stopped and looked south across the field. I followed her gaze. The eastern pasture, Dale's retained section, was visible from here, and there, moving along the fence line of his property, was a man. Too far to read features clearly, but the posture was identifiable. Someone checking fence, or more likely, I thought, someone walking his own line to look across at hers. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned back to the wire and picked up the tensioner. "Rust on this post," she said. "We'll need to pack around the base." That was all. She did not stop again to look. She did not change her pace or her expression. She picked up the tensioner and she worked. I found that almost unbearable to watch, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. The restraint of it. The sheer disciplined refusal to let his presence on the edge of her vision determine the content of her morning. I picked up my end of the wire and worked. Over the following weeks, I moved on eventually, but I came back, because I told myself I was in the area, though I'll admit my routing had become somewhat Mara-centric. Things began to change on those 62 acres in ways that were quiet at first, and then suddenly, all at once, visible. Petrus's brother delivered the hydraulic pump. A mechanic from town, a man named Osvaldo who'd apparently known Mara since childhood, came out twice to help with the 30-20 installation and refused payment both times, though he accepted dinner and was apparently an agreeable dinner guest because he came back a third time without a mechanical reason. The tractor started in the 3rd week of September. I wasn't there when it started. She told me about it later, matter-of-factly, the way she told me most things, as events rather than triumphs. But Petrus's son had apparently been helping that afternoon, and according to Petrus, the boy had let out a noise like a coyote when the engine caught, and Mara had allowed herself a smile for approximately 3 seconds before she put the machine in gear and started working. 3 seconds, I wrote it down. The soil amendment program was underway by early October. She'd found a cost-share program through the Extension Service, something she'd researched herself, applying without telling anyone she was applying, learning the form requirements and the documentation standards and the specific language that made the difference between a successful application and one that disappeared into the bureaucracy unread. When the approval came through, she called Petrus. She didn't call anyone else. The field peas went in. The vetch cover came on fast across the South 30. She planted garlic in the orchard understory, something she'd read about, guild planting, the idea that the right companion plants could help the old trees without competing with them. She was not certain it would work. She told me as much, standing in the orchard one afternoon while the light came sideways through the apple branches. "I might be wrong," she said. "You might," I said. "About several things," she said. "That's generally true of plans," I said. She looked at me. For a moment there was something in her expression that wasn't the flat, purposeful calm I'd come to expect, something more unguarded. Not grief exactly. More like the face of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a long time and has just briefly, privately, acknowledged the weight. "I don't know if any of this works," she said. I don't know if the soil comes back fast enough. I don't know if the buyer stays interested. I don't know if the orchard responds. She paused. I don't know if I'm the right person for this. I didn't say she was, because I don't know what she is or isn't the right person for, and because empty reassurance delivered by passing strangers is worth exactly what it costs. What I said was, the hydraulic pump is in and the tractor runs. She looked at me for another second. Yeah, she said, it does. She walked back toward the field. I wrote in my log, she knows what she doesn't know. That's not doubt. That's intelligence. There's a difference, and most people never learn it. The thing about watching someone build something from rubble is that it doesn't look like building. Not at first. At first it looks like repair, like stopgap measures, like daily improvisation, like managing disaster. The architecture only becomes visible from a distance, and only then if you know what you're looking at. I knew what I was looking at because I'd seen enough broken things to understand the difference between someone who works on a broken thing to hold on and someone who works on a broken thing to make it into something else entirely. Mara was doing the second thing. The city buyer came out in November. Two of them, a young man named Soren and a woman named Gabrielle, who apparently handled the sourcing decisions and had the measured, specific way of looking at land that told you she'd been doing this long enough to have preferences. Mara walked them through the fields and the orchard, speaking about the soil amendment timeline, the planned crop rotations, the heritage apple varieties and their flavor profiles, and the harvest windows. She had documents. She'd prepared them herself, printouts, organized in a folder precise. I was nearby doing something with a gate and not pretending otherwise. At one point, Gabrielle stopped in the middle of the orchard and just looked up at the old trees, their gnarled architecture against the November sky, their remaining apples dark and late, the smell of cold and earth and something faintly sweet underneath. These are real, Gabrielle said, not to Mara, to herself. They're 90 years old, Mara said. They taste like it, Gabrielle said. The contract that eventually resulted from that visit was not enormous. It was a beginning, which is different. A beginning with specific volumes and specific delivery windows and a price per pound that was, Mara told me later with the careful tone of someone doing mental arithmetic, sufficient if the other pieces came together. If that word was doing considerable work in her life that winter. I rode out in December. The last time I saw her before the spring, she was in the barn with the 30-20 running a diagnostic before putting it to bed for the coldest months. She had a new logbook, spiral-bound, like the repair manual notebook, which I found privately gratifying. She'd started keeping records of inputs, outputs, costs, observations. The same instinct that made her diagram, the hydraulic system, now applied to the farm itself. She was becoming fluent in a language she'd never been taught. The last thing she said to me, December, from the barn doorway with the cold coming in. I'm going to need a second tractor by spring if the south fields come in. That's a problem for spring, I said. I came back in April. I tell myself I was passing through again, but I've been telling myself I was passing through for 8 months at this point, and I'm a man who keeps an honest log, so I'll note here. I was not passing through. I made a deliberate route through country that was somewhat out of my way because I wanted to see what had happened on 62 acres between December and spring. What I found was not what I expected. Not because it was worse. Because it was more complicated. The south fields were in, field peas, a neat and vigorous stand, the green of it almost startling against the brown of the surrounding land. The vetch cover had overwintered well. The soil amendment program had done what soil amendment programs do when applied with diligence and given enough time. It had done something, not everything, but something measurable, visible, real. The orchard was in early bloom. The garlic had come up clean in the understory. Standing among the old trees in the April morning, I could feel the specific quality of the air that means a place is not dead. A living complexity. A layered smell of blossom and soil and last year's grass and something indefinably older. Something the trees had been producing for 90 years regardless of what the humans around them were doing. There was also a second tractor. It was a 1978 Case 1175, and it was not in perfect condition, but it was running. Parked beside the old John Deere in the morning light, the two machines had the slightly mismatched quality of a partnership that was functional rather than elegant, which struck me as appropriate. I found Mara behind the barn reviewing what turned out to be seeding paperwork, plans for the north section, which she was putting into specialty vegetables for the farm-to-table contract. Squash, heirloom tomatoes, several varieties of dried beans. A crop plan that was specific and documented and built on research she'd done through the winter. Beside the paperwork was the new logbook, now considerably thicker than it had been in December. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "The casework," I said, looking back at the barn. "Well enough," she said. "Osvaldo found it. Woman over in Hartley County was selling her late husband's equipment, paid $2,000 for it." She paused. "I didn't have $2,000. How'd you manage it?" She looked at me with the expression she used when I'd asked a question she considered slightly obvious. "I asked Petrus if I could borrow against the apple harvest. A private loan against a future crop. Not a bank, not a program, not a formal instrument. 2 women, an orchard, and the specific kind of trust that comes from watching someone work through a bad situation without complaining." I wrote in my log, she understood that the currency available to her wasn't money. It was reputation. She'd been spending it wisely for 8 months. The spring was not easy. I should be clear about that, because there's a version of this story that becomes clean and triumphant from this point forward, and that's not the story I watched. The story I watched was operational and difficult, and full of small emergencies that had to be managed in sequence before they became large emergencies. The irrigation system, older than the 3020, original to the farm's construction in the 1950s, developed a leak in late April that flooded the southeast corner of the Northfield and required 3 days of hand digging to locate, and 2 days of repair that Mara performed herself with plumbing components she'd ordered online and learned to install from a YouTube tutorial she'd watched on her phone propped against a coffee mug. The heirloom tomato seedlings she'd started inside were set back by a late cold snap that she'd known was possible and had prepared for partially but not entirely. She lost 30% of the trays and had to replant, which pushed the delivery schedule for that crop 2 weeks and required a difficult conversation with Gabrielle. Conducted over a phone call that lasted 45 minutes, and that Mara walked through afterward looking like someone who had recently held a position they weren't certain they had the right to hold. She was understanding, Mara said. "But," I said. "But understanding isn't the same as unaffected," Mara said. "There are other suppliers. I need to be reliable." She looked at the recovered seedlings in the greenhouse she'd built from salvaged windows and 2x4s over the winter. "I can't lose another 30%. "You won't," I said. She looked at me. "That's not a prediction," I said. "That's an observation. You've already figured out what you did wrong." She'd added a thermal mass system to the greenhouse, water barrels painted black, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night. That cost almost nothing, and that she'd designed by reading about passive solar heat retention for 3 evenings in a row. It was not sophisticated engineering. It was sufficient engineering, applied at exactly the right moment. This was the rhythm of how she worked: problem, research, solution, implementation, documentation. The logbook recorded everything: cost per bed foot, yield per variety, hours of labor per task. She was building a body of knowledge that didn't exist before, specific to this land, this soil, these particular trees and their particular needs. She couldn't afford to hire expertise, so she was becoming it. I found that both admirable and, in moments, quietly painful to watch, because it meant she was doing alone what people are supposed to do in partnership. The research, the planning, the physical work, the financial calculus. The worry, which she carried visibly only in certain moments, usually late in the day, when the light had gone and there was a pause between doing things and the exhaustion of the day arriving. In those moments, she sometimes just sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while she looked at something I couldn't see. I did not interrupt those moments. I wrote in my log and let her be. There was a morning in late May that I want to write down carefully, because I've thought about it often since. She had gone over to check the orchard, a morning routine she kept without fail, whatever else was happening. And I was in the barn doing something useless with a piece of equipment that didn't need my attention, which is my own way of being somewhere without being somewhere. I heard her voice from the orchard, and the tone of it made me set down what I was pretending to do and walk out. She was standing under the oldest tree in the orchard, a wealthy apple probably planted by her grandmother in the first year of the orchard's existence, its trunk now 3 feet in diameter and its branches in the specific sprawl of extreme age. And the tree was in full blossom. Not unusual, it had bloomed every year, presumably for 90 years. But something in the pruning she'd done over the winter, or the garlic in the understory, or the amended soil, or the reduced competition, or simply the particular combination of rainfall and temperature that spring had delivered, had produced a bloom unlike anything in the years prior. The branches were white with it. The smell was thick enough to be almost physical. She was looking up at it with an expression I had never seen on her face in all the months I'd been coming and going. Not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of the plan working. Something quieter, something closer to recognition. Like meeting a thing you'd been trying to reach for a long time and finding it more itself than you'd imagined. Not smaller, but stranger and better and more real. She stayed there for a while. I didn't approach. Eventually she turned and walked back toward the field, and her pace had the particular quality of someone whose body is lighter than it was an hour ago. I wrote in my log, the tree bloomed. That's all. Sometimes the notation is enough. The summer was the year of the pivot's proof. The squash came in generous and clean. The heirloom tomatoes, recovered from the cold snap, better than projected, delivered to Gabrielle's team in 3 successive batches through July and August, the quality drawing a response that Mara showed me once and then filed away. Your tomatoes are creating a problem. Everyone wants more of them. The field peas turned under as planned, left behind the nitrogen they'd fixed. The South 30 was, by August's end, measurably different soil than it had been the previous year. Not restored, she told me that clearly because she didn't speak in restorations she hadn't earned, but changed. Moving. The apple harvest in October was the largest the orchard had produced in 11 years, according to a record she'd found in her grandmother's own logbook, which she'd discovered in a box in the farmhouse attic during a winter evening, and had spent 2 days reading before she told me about it. Her grandmother had kept records, harvest volumes, weather notes, small observations. 90 years back, this woman had stood in this same orchard and written things down because she was afraid of forgetting. When Mara told me about the logbook, she used the careful tone she used when something had moved her that she wasn't ready to talk about directly. I did not press. I wrote in my own log, the grandmother kept records, the granddaughter keeps records, the orchard remembers them both. The sale of the apple harvest, both to Gabrielle's operation and to 2 additional buyers she'd added through a farmer's market presence she'd started in June, because she decided that visibility was worth the Saturday mornings. Put her in a position she had not been in since before the divorce. Not comfort exactly, not safety, but solvency. The particular solvency of someone who has outrun the disaster by 1 season and knows they need to do it again, and the time after that, and the time after that. But who has now done it once, which is different from never having done it. I was there in early November when Patris came by. Mara repaid the loan she'd taken against the apple harvest, in cash, to the dollar, with what appeared to be a bottle of something she'd preserved from the orchard included as additional consideration. Patris looked at the envelope for a moment. "You didn't have to rush this," Patris said. "I know," Mara said. They stood there for a moment, 2 women in the November light, and something passed between them that was not said out loud, and that I was not meant to understand entirely. Then Patris pocketed the envelope, and said something about her son needing help with a school project on soil science, and whether Mara might be willing to come speak to his class. I wrote she is becoming for the people around her a thing they didn't know they needed, a reference point. There was a day in late November when I finally asked her. Not about the farm, I knew the farm. I asked about what she'd thought that first morning, standing in front of the broken tractor, knowing what had been done to it. She was quiet for a while. "I thought about selling," she said. "Not for long, but I thought about it." "What stopped you?" She looked at me. "The orchard," she said. "My grandmother planted those trees. She planted them knowing she wouldn't live to see them at their full size. She planted them for someone she hadn't met yet." A pause. "I thought, if I sell, what was that for?" I wrote it down verbatim. Then she said, "I also thought he'd be satisfied, and that bothered me more than anything else." I almost wrote that down too, but it felt too private. Some things you carry and don't record. I left again in December. I always leave. It's the nature of the life I've chosen, moving through country, carrying a log, stopping when something worth stopping for appears. I told myself I'd come back in the spring. I rode east on a cold, clear day, and I turned in the saddle once to look back at the farm. The fields resting under their winter cover, the orchard standing in its age and its 90 years of accumulation, the two tractors visible through the open barn door, the farmhouse with its still unreplaced roof that was on the list for next year, the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the windless morning. I rode in my log that night, at a table in a roadside place by lamplight. The broken tractor runs, the South 30 is healing. The grandmother's trees bloomed better than they had in 11 years. She is not finished.